heat of the matter in terms of looking at some of the regulatory considerations and updates that we're seeing globally, and then touching upon harmonization, always a key topic, and then some final conclusions. So if we can turn to the next slide. So when we talk about ground components, we're focusing today on LEO constellations, but whether we're talking LEO or GEO, satellite systems consist of the satellites, but also the ground components. And for purposes of today, when we're talking about the ground components, we're going to focus on the gateways and the end user terminals. Now, of course, on the next slide, we'll reflect what do we mean when we're talking about the user terminals and the gateways. If we can turn to the next slide. Next, okay. So when we're talking about the user terminals, what are we talking about? We're talking about the device that allows consumers to get connectivity, whether it be at their home, whether it be at their business, on a ship, on an aircraft. And we're also seeing the capability today of getting connectivity through terminals via IoT sensors and now mobile devices. This can be integrated, this can be connected via Wi-Fi routers to distribute connectivity. In terms of spectrum, always a key topic, the user terminals primarily operate in the Ku and Ka band. Switching over to the gateways, when we talk about gateways, we're talking about the connection between the satellite constellation and the terrestrial backbone. We're talking about what directs traffic to the IXP and then to partner networks, to the public internet, to the cloud, to the data center infrastructure to facilitate the service of broadband services. Here, when we talk about spectrum issues, the LEO gateways are primarily operating in the Ka band, but we're also seeing some use of the E band, as well as some some Q and V band spectrum as well. Turning to the next slide. So now let's frame the issue in terms of the regulatory considerations and updates. On this slide, we're going to focus on some of the issues and considerations that we're seeing with regards to the gateway and all the elements surrounding gateways. So what are we seeing? We're seeing many national regulators updating their rules or developing new rules to address LEO constellations. If we look globally, we're looking, at least in terms of our tracking, we've seen quite a number of consultations. At least 15 to 20 regulators have conducted consultations. Some might be more inquiries and a list of questions. Some might be more proposing rules, and some may be more at the decision-making rule landscape and have actually introduced new rules with regards to NGSO related issues. Some of these countries include not only Brazil and the UK, which we have today, but also countries like Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, among others, and we may be missing a few. Now, whether you are GEO or LEO, you have to comply with the requisite satellite framework that exists. But with LEOs, you have certain issues that are raising some flags in terms of some changes that might be necessary. So when we talk about gateways, LEO constellations are slightly different in that you're looking at more gateways and so therefore more licensing, which makes it more cumbersome for the operator. You also have issues with regards to potentially scarcity of sites because you have only a certain number of sites that might be particularly attractive due to access to infrastructure, due to a good site because it's potentially freer from interference. So these types of issues are coming up. And we're seeing some trends in terms of some modifications or updates in terms of some of these gateway issues. So for example, we're seeing some streamlining in terms of gateway licensing. We're also seeing in terms of scarcity issues, we're seeing some modifications potentially in terms of the fact that operators might have certain timelines within which they have to comply before um, in order to operate these gateways. And if they don't comply, then they lose access to that site. Um, with regards to fees, we're also seeing some challenges because when you have many more gateways, obviously the fee structure is going to go up. And so there's some consideration by regulators as to whether the fee structure should change um, for these LEO constellations, since you're going to have many more uh, gateways, and to not make it prohibitive for these new constellations. On the interconnection front, you also see regulators taking a look at this because obviously access to fiber is a critical component and to backhaul. So you want to make sure that the regulatory framework that you have um, is one that is conducive to such access. And oftentimes these are access to this type of fiber is held by terrestrial operators, sometimes incumbents, and there might be some challenges relating to that. On the spectrum front, there's always issues of access and availability and potential issues with regards to interference. And those are things that are presenting some challenges that need to be looked at. And so we're seeing regulators look at um, mechanisms such as spectrum sharing, mechanisms such as interference mitigation plans, a variety of different um, measures that are being considered. And then localization. This has always been a challenging one in that in certain countries you have requirements that you have to have local gateways. Um, this is obviously an issue that increases cost for operators and also presents certain challenges in terms of deployment. So one of the things that you're seeing is uh, some advocacy on this front in terms of the fact that you have new innovations such as cloud-based processing, such as inter-satellite links that may present innovations to not having the requirement of localizations. A lot of these things are being talked about. Some have been, as I said, we have some rules that have already been adopted with regards to some of this. But I think a lot of it is still in flux. It's being discussed and it's evolving. Next slide. Addressing now the issue of user terminals, we also see some new issues being addressed in terms, particularly with regards to user terminals, customer terminals. In traditional landscapes for satellites, one of the challenges is if you classify a user terminal as an Earth station, because then you're talking about individual licensing. With these LEO constellations, you have huge amounts of customer terminals. So if you do this on an individual basis, it's very onerous. So regulators are looking at alternatives. And I think one of the measures that you're seeing become quite popular in many jurisdictions is the concept of blanket authorizations. This obviously leads to a less cumbersome process, easier deployment, and we're also seeing the same type of shift happening also with regards to mobile and nomadic terminals, eSIMs. And some countries have applied the same approach for eSIMs. For example, in the US, you have that. With regards to blanket authorizations, though, you're seeing it being implemented in a number of countries. I know Brazil is one of them. I'm sure we'll hear about that today. But we've also seen it in Mexico, in Australia, in the US. So this is definitely a trend that we're seeing, and I think it will facilitate the deployment of these types of constellations and the terminals for customers. On the fee side, similarly, I think we're seeing some modifications for customer terminals. Again, if you have individual licensing and you're imposing a fee on each terminal, you can have a very exorbitant result. So you're also seeing some countries implement a flat fee. So it's an annual flat fee that might be just a fixed price, or it might be a flat fee, but it's based on a tier. So there might be 3 tiers depending on the number of customer terminals that you have. Another issue that comes up relates to spectrum access. I know one of the challenges for us as consultants is, is the spectrum available, and getting that type of information. So transparency is always a challenge. Um, and I think the issue is coming up not only in terms of access, but also availability, and also making sure that that spectrum is actually allocated for use by these customer terminals. A last topic that I wanted to raise up is the issue of type approval, which is always and historically been a key one, and I think it's no different for these LEO constellations. Um, we see the importance, again, because you have such volume in terms of these terminals, to try and approach this from a mutual recognition and reciprocity standpoint, which is much more efficient and much more helpful from an operator perspective, uh, as opposed to requiring local certifications, which impedes the process and results in duplicative or redundancy of efforts. So these are some of the issues that we're seeing with regards to both user terminals and gateways. And one thing I also wanted to touch upon was the issue of harmonization, which I've reflected on the next slide. So one of the things that is key for any operator that is trying to deploy globally is to not have different requirements in different countries. It slows down the process and is very cumbersome. So one of the things that we're seeing is harmonization efforts happening globally through regional organizations. These are typically not mandated requirements, they're recommendations, but they're quite helpful in terms of providing some consistency of process with regards to certain things. And as you see reflected here, we see the various regional organizations, be they in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, as well as in Europe, addressing some of the topics that I've just raised in terms of blanket licensing, in terms of interference management, and trying to develop model frameworks for NGSOs. So these are efforts that we see, and that for hopefully some of the regulators that are on today can use as references for their regions, and also for the development of their own frameworks. Next slide. So in conclusion, I think what we're seeing is that, apologize, that LEO constellations are definitely an exciting new approach, and they're reshaping how we think about broadband services, how we think about new demands on gateways and user terminals. I'm sure there's some challenges from a regulatory perspective in how to deal with this, but even though the ground components might not be the sexiest topic and the coolest part of the system, they are strategic infrastructure, and they're essential to providing the connection from a broadband perspective, especially with regards to low latency and high capacity connectivity. As we've seen and as we'll hear, regulators are playing a key role. But one of the key aspects will also be ensuring that we have harmonization and scalable approaches. These will be key to ensuring that we have models that are effective and don't result in fragmentation in terms of the global delivery that these constellations are seeking to provide. Thank you.
Janet, thank you so much. We've got our work cut out for us today. This is not an easy set of problems to weave together, and they absolutely need to be addressed. So I really appreciate you bringing your perspective, not only as someone who advises governments in shaping these rules and regulations, but also as a practitioner who's, you and your team have been around the world testing out these regulatory frameworks in every day basically, and that I think will help enrich our discussion after we hear from two of the frontline regulators who've been shaping rules and considering how to deal with all this and balance all these issues. So our next speaker will bring that regulator's perspective. We're going to turn to Liz Quintana to tell us how the UK has approached this particularly from a gateway perspective. Liz, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's a real honour to be here talking about the UK's perspective here in the seminar. So if we go to the next slide. Brilliant. So Ofcom is the UK's communications, media and online regulator. The space team sits within the Spectrum Group within Ofcom, although increasingly with the arrival of consumer services from space, other parts of the organisation are also getting interested in some of the exciting new services that are coming online. Our space spectrum work falls into three broad categories. We manage the spectrum within the UK. We represent the UK at the ITU and CPT. And we are the notifying administration for satellite filings for UK organisations. The spectrum that we manage in the UK covers an increasing range of space services, from the more traditional types of services like fixed satellite services for broadband and mobile satellite services, through radio astronomy to some really exciting new services like lunar communications or space launch from the UK, which we're gearing up to enable. Thank you to Janet for mentioning the ITU and CPT. We really recognise at Ofcom the value of international regulations for global services like space services and maritime and air. We think this is really important to have harmonised regulations, and we are active both regionally and internationally to help develop those services. And a number of those recommendations and the ITU regulations are reflected in our licenses. Just a quick note before we go on. So on filings, we've traditionally seen a lot of GSO satellite filings, but increasingly now we're receiving more NGSO filings and from a wider range of new startups and other operators. So it's a very fast-moving sector with lots of interesting challenges. So we'll be just talking about a fraction of some of the things that we're doing at the moment in Ofcom, but hopefully get a flavour of some of the wider things that we're also thinking about. Next slide, please. Brilliant. So touching on gateways in the UK, there are, I know in many countries there are just, there's just one product and you tick the types of services that you want to provide. In the UK, we have three. We have the Permanent Earth Station licence, which is for connections to geostationary satellites. We have the NGSO Earth Station licence, which is for connections to NGSO. And we have non-FSS licenses, which are predominantly used for tracking, telemetry and control. So that's controlling of the satellites and some downlink from Earth observation satellites. Some of the conditions that affect gateways are in our Earth Station network license as well, particularly for NGSO, but I'll explain some of that as we go on to subsequent slides. Next slide, please. Brilliant. So we actually started our NGSO licensing journey in 2016, which was before I joined Ofcom. And there we extended an existing Earth Station network license to cover terminals on land and air connecting to NGSOs, and we created our new gateway license product. and we decided at the time that connections from ships would be reflected in the ship radio license, which is administered by the administration that of the ship's flag. Then in 2021, partly because of our northerly latitude, we started to see actual NGSO services rolling out. And we were very positive, and we remain positive about the opportunities NGSO services can provide in the UK, particularly for hard to reach places, parts of the UK where we can't get traditional terrestrial connectivity. But we also recognise that because of the dynamic nature of NGSO services, the way that satellites move relative to the Earth, the way that constellations of satellites move relative to each other, there was an increasing risk of interference. And in addition, the ITU coordination agreements that we normally rely on between GSO operators and also apply to NGSO operators, that those had not been reached at that point. There was no NGSO to NGSO coordination agreements. And so we were slightly concerned that while there would be a lot of enthusiasm for these services, that they might be a bit unreliable to consumers. And so we put in place a new application process to help manage some of the interference risks, and we placed some new conditions in the licenses for existing licensees as well. So kind of walking through some of them, we placed a requirement on NGSO licensees to cooperate with each other. So this is not, we didn't have a requirement for a full coordination agreement, but we did want to make sure that we could enable several services and they would operate reliably. So we wanted operators to talk to each other in the absence of a coordination agreement and work together to try to reach those agreements. We gave ourselves some more power to intervene quickly in cases of harmful interference. And we also placed an obligation on the satellite operator to actually hold the license. So for GSO networks, the license could be held by a reseller or the terminal operator. It could be held by the satellite operator. But in this case, because we wanted this close cooperation between satellite operators, we asked for the NGSO Earth Station Network license to be held by the satellite operator. And also, while we don't have satellite operator licenses in the UK, we wanted to make sure that if there was interference that was experienced from the satellite down into terminals or gateway Earth stations, and we needed the operator to change the way that they were operating, that they would be able to do that too in both directions. So, and I'm just trying to think, we asked for, we set up a short consultation period anytime we received a new application, whether that was for the Earth Station network for all the terminals or whether that was for the gateway. And we asked for some additional evidence up front that the operator could coexist alongside existing licensees. It had the flexibility to accommodate other operators should new operators want to start operating in the UK, that they could protect some existing co-frequency Earth stations that were already registered in the master register, and also a competition check. And I'll come to the reason why for that in a little bit. For gateways in particular, we asked for them to only connect to licensed NGSO systems, and this is because of this obligation on the for the operator to hold it, and so that they would be covered by some of the conditions that we place on the operator through the Earth Station Network license. And we asked that they would start transmitting within 12 months of receiving a license. Now, the reason for both the competition check and for this kind of limit was because we saw in some architectures interest in having a lot of NGSO gateways, and also initially concerns in the industry that they would need to have quite large distances between each gateway, and the UK is not a very large country. So given the number of, we had about 15 teleports operating in the UK at the time, and although there could be greenfield sites that could be developed, we were slightly concerned that maybe some of the newer operators might come in and take up those sites, and it might block others coming down the line. So we just wanted to check as part of the process that we had a vibrant competitive environment. So next slide, please, I think. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, so I'm very happy to pick up on any of those points. So the other thing we really wanted to do is there was quite a lot of information that new applicants might need, and so we put everything in one place to make it really easy for applicants to find. So there's one website with the guidance on how to apply, a list of the existing licensees, so they could see who they needed to engage with before they applied. Information on applicants as well, so that again they were aware of others who might also be interested in operating in the UK, and a list of the co-frequency earth stations that must be protected. So hopefully that is helpful for operators as they think about putting together that information. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, could we just go back? So just to say, there are now 7 NGSO operators who hold Earth Station Network licenses. So they have the authorization to operate in the UK. 2 have satellites in the sky and are providing services today. Others will be starting to deploy over the next year or 2, and so we'll see these services really pick up. In terms of gateways, and again, you can find this on our website, there are 7 NGSO gateway earth stations. They are all connecting to the Starlink service. And I think that reflects the slightly different architectures that different operators have put in place. So yes, that's where we are at the moment. And again, you can see that on the website. Sorry, next slide, please. Just to say that we also published a space spectrum strategy in 2022, recognising that there was a lot going on in the space sector. There was a lot going on, in particular in the UK, in the space sector, and we wanted to try to get a handle on all the spectrum demands and try to get a plan around the many changes that we might need to make to keep pace with what was going on in the sector. So in addition to our NGSO licensing process, which currently covers KU and KA band, there were a number of other things that we said that we would do, which will affect or benefit NGSO services in the UK. So the first is we recognise the importance of the KA band more generally. That band is shared in the UK with some fixed services. And between the satellite and the fixed services, there were some guard bands. Satellite operators can operate across the whole of the KA band, subject to commercial arrangements with the existing licensees. But we wanted to make sure that if those arrangements were in place, that there weren't gaps that the gateways couldn't use. And then as we were considering that, one of the existing fixed links spectrum licensees handed back their license, so there was a bit more available. And so we have brought our licenses up to date to make sure that that spectrum is available to gateway operators. And then for the remaining spectrum, we considered an over-the-top license, but we felt on reflection that the commercial arrangements were working, and so we've decided to maintain the current system for that. We had a lot of interest after the NGSO licensing process was put in place, so that very much addressed NGSO to NGSO coexistence. Other users like GSO operators and radio astronomy who operate adjacent to the bottom of the KU band. We're concerned that they may also suffer interference. So we have updated our Earth Station network license to reflect existing international protections that are in place, and that just allows us to very quickly, if there is a case of interference, respond based on our own national authorizations. And we are currently considering expanding our gateway licenses to include QV and E-band. We ran a call for input last year, and there seems to be quite a few interesting services coming along. So we will be consulting on that later this year. We also said that we might consider reviewing our fee for NGSO gateways. So at the moment, the fee is £500 annually for NGSO gateways, but the permanent Earth Station licenses for connections to GSO use administered incentive pricing. So that's kind of more similar to what other spectrum users are paying. And particularly as you start to think about QV and E-band, because they use much, much wider bandwidths, the discrepancy between that fixed cost fee and the AIP fee becomes much, much larger. So we are considering whether or not we want to make the fee a bit more similar across the two products. And finally, we have been developing a national NGSO monitoring service in the UK. We recognise that interference between NGSO operators could be quite localised, and the system that we used to all be familiar with using, where we had regional centres, regional monitoring centres that we could all use, may not pick up the interference that that might be experienced within our borders. So we've been looking at working through the International Space Radio Monitoring Meeting and Working Party 1 to consider some internationally agreed regulations for how we could all do this, but also looking to develop some equipment and some data sharing with existing spectrum users to help us adapt to the changing interference environment. And sorry, I think I've gone ahead 2 slides, but and this is the last one, I promise. Just to summarise, so these are on the left, all the things I said we've already done, and on the right, all the things that we said we're going to do. We normally publish every March our plan for the forthcoming year. I don't think it's quite out yet, but these were the things that we put forward in our proposal in December. So again, please keep an eye out for that. But something along the lines of the box on the right is likely to be what we focus on for the next year. Thank you.
Liz, thank you so much. It's clear that you all have been incredibly busy. This has been an area that has demanded a lot of brain power and a lot of administrative work as well. So, and it also reminds us that, the work isn't once and done, really. It sounds like you've been realizing that the evolving technologies, the evolving understanding of how they're being used and how they're being demanded is also demanding the regulator continue to look to consider and reconsider these rules. So we'll come back to that as well. But you all have been very busy. Thank you for sharing that lineup of a pretty extraordinary work. So similarly, we're going to turn to another regulator's perspective, but before we turn to Kim, I want to make sure that you all are aware that we're going to take questions at the end of this. I've got a bunch of questions that have been raised by our conversations already. So I'll start out with a few moderator questions, but if you want, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. If you have questions, you can enter them there. The ITU team is going to curate them and kind of gather the ones that show up more regularly and make sure that I see the questions that we think will add to this discussion. So feel free to add your questions in that Q&A box. I've seen a couple really good ones already. So we're going to round out our discussion now with Kim. to give the kind of the counterpart as a regulatory practitioner from Brazil's perspective, with a focus on the user terminal that Janet described for us, and the the last piece of our ground networks discussion. Kim, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you, guys. Good morning. Good afternoon. First, I'd like to greet my colleagues on the panel and thank the ITU for the opportunity to be part of this important discussion. I also like to sincerely thank Patricia for the kind introduction and for all support throughout the preparations. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, guys. Well, I'm very pleased to join the Space Connect session to share a little bit about the Brazilian perspective on how we are adapting our regulatory structure to the new constellation. So today I'll share some information regarding our regulatory framework for the use of satellites, and Brazil present to you some numbers of our market and how we update our regulation. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So I'd like to start mentioning the importance of satellite systems to our country. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world by area, with 8.5 million square kilometers. And we also have a population over to 12 million people, ranking 70 globally. So it's a lot of people to connect, and obviously satellite, it's an important part of this infrastructure in our country. This scale brings obviously great opportunity, but also significant regulatory and infrastructure challenges, especially when it comes to universal connective and connect areas, rural areas, or areas where the terrestrial infrastructures cannot reach for different reasons. On top of that, recently we observed the use of satellite systems to support different applications. Today we are talking about broadband applications, obviously, but it's important to mention that we have a lot of IoT applications starting to connect people around our country and provide capacity to agriculture, logistic, and for utilities, for example, just to make you understand how our market is growing. So next slide, please. Thank you so much. About our market, it's interesting to check that all main global players are authorized here in Brazil. We have 48 GSO satellites and 17 non-GSO satellite systems already authorized to operate in our country. It's not only, these numbers are not only for FSS, but just to show you how our market has been organized. I'll explain better in the next slides, but just to highlight in here, in our authorization model, we grant landing rights for satellite systems, so the operator is authorized to use satellites and associated Earth station in our territory, operating in specific frequency bands. The market is growing every day. Today we have more than 500,000 satellite broadband users. What it means that we have 500,000 Earth stations operating in Brazil just for broadband access. And when we consider other services, Brazil hosts a significant number of Earth stations in operation. In the satellite pay TV, for example, our latest numbers indicate that more than 4 million users are currently accessing DTH service across the country. So we see clear signs of market adoption and interest in satellite basic connectivity. So it's so interesting to have this conversation here and give the opportunity to talk about it. Next, please. Now just a quick overview of our regulation and policy, just so you understand how we are, how our model to authorize systems here in Brazil. It's a little bit different from the UK's perspective. Between 2020 and 2021, we approved our general regulation on satellite exploration and the general regulation on the licenses of stations, updating our regulatory framework. Among the key changes, we can mention that we define a simplified process for granting landing rights here in Brazil. We established a flat regulatory price around $20,000 for granting landing rights, regardless of frequency band, number of satellites, or Earth stations that are operating in the systems. It was flat. And we also established clear rules on renewals of authorizations. And one important point is that we define a new approach to coordination. We start to see a lot of systems interest to work in Brazil, and we need to establish a new approach, a new model for our country to coordinate these kind of systems to guarantee that we have a coexistence and free harm interference in our country. So we define a national coordination priority to bring legal certainty to existing and incoming operators. It means that newcomers must obtain the coordination agreement from the incumbent systems here in Brazil. So when a new operator intends to provide capacity and the Brazilian territory, it is necessary to find a technical solution to coexist among different systems. So it was a key change in our regulation, and it was important considering that we were seeing a growing number of users in our country, and this legal certainty is obviously so important to our market and to attract new investment in our country. So next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So considering the regulation that is enforced, Brazil follows an open sky policy. We welcome in both national and foreign satellite operators. We grant landing rights valid for up to 15 years with the possibility of renewal. For GSO systems, this renewal depends on the lifetime of the satellite. For non-GSO, we have a lot of different discussions for this renewal process, considering competitive aspects and public interest as well. But it's important to mention that it's possible to renew, and we try to make it as clear as possible to guarantee this legal certainty to the investors in our country. So the authorization process includes legal, regulatory, and technical assessment. Notably, foreign operators must appoint a Brazilian legal representative and demonstrate that frequencies are properly allocated and coordinated with other systems that are already authorized here in Brazil. Next, please. Thanks. Just to give you an overview of our policy and you understand how we are dealing with coordination process. As I mentioned before, we establish a national coordination priority, especially considering that satellite systems could be associated with different filings submitted to ITU, and these different filings have different coordination priorities, international level. So we adopt this approach to bring certainty to our process. So Brazil applies a first come, first served model to analyze all the application systems with coordination priority, as I mentioned before, must be respected by new applicants. And if coordination agreements cannot reach into the moments of the application, we could authorize the systems considering non-interference, non-protection basis for these newcomers. So it's possible to have the authorization, even if you do not have all the coordination agreements yet, but it's necessary to continue the process of coordination and submit all the documentation to Anatel to guarantee that you were working and operating in this non-interference, non-protection basis. Please, next slide. So just to make it more clear as possible and help us in our discussions and questions after this explanation, I'd like to share you a Brazilian model for satellite service. Our regulatory model involves 4 key players, basically the satellite operator, that is the company authorized to provide capacity in Brazil. delivery representative that is required for foreign operators. The service provider that is authorized to deliver telecom service using the satellite capacity. So it's another company, could be a company, or it need to be a company organized under Brazilian law, and the end user who receive and get a service. So this is one important information that I believe that it's relevant to mention right now, because we authorize the satellite operator, we grant a landing right here, but the service provider, it's a different entity, it's a different company that must be organized under Brazilian law, although it may be controlled by the satellite operator company and belong to the same corporate group. It must be legally established in Brazil for country reasons, taxes, etc. So this structure helps us to ensure that our responsibilities, technical, legal, and commercial, are clearly assigned to these different entities here that we are showing to you. Thank you. So next slide, please. Now let's take a look at our licensing process. It's interesting to understand that, because sometimes licensing, it's a term that are used for authorization as a whole in different countries. And I would just like to highlight that in Brazil, in addition to the landing rights that authorizes the use of spectrum in orbit, all Earth stations and space stations must be licensed here. What it means, it's a different kind of authorization. It's a second step before you start operate here in Brazil. So the Earth station licensing is the responsibility of the service provider who leases the capacity, the satellite capacity from the satellite operator. Typically, and it's important to mention that new coordination is not required at this stage, as long as the station complies with the technical conditions defined by Anatel and conditions from satellite operators agreement. So if the service provider respects all these conditions, it's not necessary to run a new coordination process. It's important to make it easier and faster. So we established a multi-step authorization model as a common for a satellite operation. First, satellite must obtain landing rights, which authorize them to lease capacity. The services are then responsible for licensing the gateway station and user terminals. Again, this model allows Anatel to conduct a more detailed evaluation during the landing rights phase, but particularly regarding coordination agreements. And as a result of this, the station licensing process becomes faster and simple. So without the need of complex interference analysis at this stage. Obviously, in the event of harm interference, Anatel has the authority to intervene and request the technical adjustment be made by satellite operators or the service provider. But we are trying to simplify our processes, our licensing process, considering just this huge amount of Earth stations that we need to do daily. Wow. That's it. Thanks to the success of our pre-coordination model, we have not received any reports of interference affecting gateway stations due to other satellite systems operating in Brazil. What is great, because we have a lot of gateways already licensed here in our country. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just to mention as more detail about our process for licensing this ground segment, gateways and VSATs. We offer here, we have two types of licensing. As mentioned before, individual licensing that required for gateway station, for example, which must submit precise location and frequency information about the operation of this specific station. And we also have the blanket licensing process, which allows multiple similar Earth stations to be approved as a group, to be licensed as a group. Currently, we have around 1 million Earth stations licensing under blanket licensing process, and about 30,000 Earth stations to individual licensing. I mean 1 million because here we have also not only broadband, etc. I mentioned a different number in the beginning of the presentation, but here I'm just putting together all kind of service just to give you a figure about our market so far. So according to my recent research, we have more than 50 gateways associated with non-geostationary satellites licensed here in Brazil. Okay, so obviously it's interesting to mention that we also apply fees for station licensing, and currently licensing for a VSAT, a small terminal, is it's something about $5 when you request the licensing for each Earth station. So next slide, please. Great. Just to mention what kind of stations could be licensed to these different process. User terminals, VSATs smaller than 2.4 diameters, and mobile stations not otherwise listed here are subject to this blanket licensing to make the process faster and simpler as possible. At this point, Earth Station in Motion still require individual licensing, but Anatel is actively working on enable blanket licensing for ESIMs as well, considering the recommendations from CITEL and other international bodies. On the other hand, as we mentioned, gateway must go through an individual licensing process. This requires submitting more detailed information on the exact location of the station and specific frequency bands intended for use. And it's important to coordination process, as I mentioned before, when a newcomer have this information, it's easier to coordinate with the other or with the incumbent satellite operators. And I would like to highlight that Anatel follows an open data policy. So in our website, we show several data dashboards with various information on frequency use authorization and license stations. So we have all the information about the license stations in our website, so you can check there and see how many gateways we have licensed so far and what is the satellite systems associated with this gateway and other stations. Next, please. Oh, okay, so just in summary, Brazil is adapting its regulatory framework to support the new reality of LEO systems and dynamic satellite operations while maintaining clarity, transparency, and legal certainty. We believe the regulatory innovation is essential to enabling the full potential of satellite communications in emerging markets. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Kim. I think you all can see, I mean, a couple really obvious takeaways here. One of them is the ground networks, the gateways and the terminals are a lively area for regulatory consideration, regulatory updates, and ongoing consideration. I mean, it is really staggering to see how much work you both agencies have put in, and I'm sure, Janet, from your perspective, how busy you've been both advising and trying to keep up for your clients to make sense of these. I want to make sure that everyone knows we're going to post both this video of our chat and the presentations on the Space Connect website, so you'll be able to look at them in more detail as soon as we put them up. And we'll also be looking for supporting documentation that we can maybe add. I think Janet was thinking about maybe some of the consultations that she mentioned from the regional groups may be available for us to share to create kind of a resource on this complicated and kind of quickly moving topic. So thank you, Kim, for that overview, and to all of our presenters for kind of unpacking this sometimes overlooked set of questions and topics. And also thanks for all of you for adding questions into the Q&A. We're going to turn to those after I ask I take my moderator's privilege and ask a couple questions of our panelists to move us into the Q&A session. So the first question I wanted to ask all of you is that these LEO constellations have, kind of proliferated in an unexpectedly rapid time frame. And with a lot of diverse projects still in the pipeline, as someone who was, involved in the development and deployment of one of the early systems, it is really exciting to see not only how many subscribers there are, 500,000 subscribers in Brazil alone, when the global number of GEO satellite broadband subscribers had usually been around sort of the 200,000. It had been a much smaller number in the past. So this is very exciting to see such response from a consumer perspective, but also the sheer number of LEO constellations that are out getting their regulatory authorizations and participating in the consultations and the formation of new rules. So that's really exciting. But that's not my question, because that's just kind of great to see. My question really has to do with all of those constellations working against the clock to raise money, build and deploy spacecraft so that they meet their deployment milestone requirements, and they want to all get a footing in the markets to provide services around the world. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about how you balance that push-pull of your citizens pressing for new service, maybe some hesitance from traditional terrestrial broadband providers, or just getting used to the new services and kind of validating their readiness, and the need to build the right oversight with licensing frameworks, and all of that kind of matched against the eagerness, we'll call it, of the companies themselves. Liz, why don't I ask you, because I know I was part of the problem in the UK. Go ahead and tell me how do you balance all of that when you've got companies knocking on your door, you've got citizens saying we need better alternatives, but you also want to make sure you're being a responsible regulator and looking at all these other considerations. And Kim, it's coming to you too, and Janet as well. Don't relax.
Yeah. So helpfully, our Wireless Telegraphy Act, which sets out how we manage the spectrum in the UK, kind of sets that out quite clearly for us. And we are here to make sure that we use spectrum, which is a very valuable and finite resource, efficiently. So, when we make any decisions about who to authorize, how they use the spectrum, how much service we give to any one service, balancing different needs, that is the number one driver. And we're really big on spectrum sharing as well. So to the extent that we possibly can, allow multiple different types of services and multiple users to use the spectrum, we will try to do that. We have to act in the interest of citizens and consumers, absolutely. And it's been really interesting, the sudden uptick. I think the interest in satellite services has gone up fourfold, fivefold in the UK. I mean, we're smaller, so we don't get as many numbers as maybe in Brazil, and we've been really blessed with very, very good terrestrial infrastructure. So maybe the number of people that would need to rely on satellite is smaller, but still, that is a driver, definitely. Trying to think. So spectrum efficiency, competition is always really important. So again, that's why we're keen to enable multiple NGSO operators. I think at the beginning of any sector, it's not our place as regulators to pick winners. The market will do that, but we do want to make sure that there is choice for consumers, and that's the best way for them to get value for money and really good services. And the fourth one, which I've forgotten.
You don't have to have four if you don't.
Enabling innovation, that's the last one. Yeah, and growth. So yeah, absolutely, very excited by all of these new space services, and to the extent that we can, bearing in mind all the other kind of duties that we have, that is another thing that we endeavour to do wherever possible.
And one of the things I would just observe between both Brazil and the UK is both governments have had very clear, very purposeful goals on connectivity. And I think that's been, part of the prompt of dedicating so many government resources and deliberative time and effort to these regulations, is that there's a real intent behind this. Kim, did you have anything you wanted to add to that from Brazil's perspective? And then Janet, I'm going to ask you on sort of a global basis, any other kind of notable countries. Kim?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you, Patricia. And I just want to echo with Lee's and really good comments. And it's interesting to see the difference of the countries, because obviously we have a huge area and sometimes it's hard to reach with the terrestrial infrastructure. It's different. We have different perspectives, but it's really good to hear from you and your thoughts. So from our regulatory perspective, especially in a country as vast and diverse as Brazil, we clearly see the tension between market momentum and regulatory readiness, because it's necessary to not put barriers here to the evolution of technical evolution, but it's important to state this certainty in our country. On one side, there is growing demand from users, especially in remote and underserved area, for more affordable, low latency, high capacity connectivity. And these areas, LEO systems have the potential to bring a new perspective that the traditional infrastructures are not capable so far. So on the other side, regulators must work to ensure that this innovation does not come at the cost of fragmented net frameworks, interference risk, or lack of long-term sustainability. So our challenge is to be agile without sacrificing transparency and legal certainty. So this is one our hard works here in Brazil. And despite the need to quickly meet this demand for connectivity, we understand that evaluation process for authorizing new systems in Brazil must be true and rigorous to avoid any kind of interference. But yeah, we are seeing this kind of tension and trying to be transparent, to put everyone on the table, have a lot of dialogues, participate in different international forums to get information and to collaborate with the other countries, regionally or even globally, because we understand the importance of this kind of infrastructure, not only for Brazil, but for all the world.
Janet, thank you, Kim. Do you see, Janet, any like sort of themes or common threads for regulators that have had sort of an easier time grappling with these updates and new questions related to constellations and their ground systems? Are there, kind of any best practices that you can help not only with the outcome, but with the process of sifting through these competing interests and responsibilities, and the sense of urgency that exists?
Well, I think both of these regulators, but I think Kim and Liz have both reflected the fact that one of the key components is the fact that this is hard labor. These are complex issues, but you have operators that are on the ground that are very familiar with the challenges they're facing. And I think these types of consultations and having multiple consultations and having notices of inquiries with regards to questions, because I think, as Liz says, I mean, there's issues that they may have decided on, but then they may need some tweaking. Maybe something that you thought was a challenge, actually the market worked itself out. So, it might be that you might be over-regulating. There might be new issues that come up as some of new innovations come out with regards to some of these systems. I mentioned intersatellite links. What implication is that going to have with regards to the ground components? So there are evolving issues. But I think one of the things that I love to hear, and I think both regulators have indicated, is the efforts at transparency. The fact that, I mean, I, as a consultant, can tell you the challenges when you can't find information, and the fact that, you have websites that have, data on them in terms of who are the licensees, who are, what is the spectrum availability, data dashboards. I think that's very helpful. And I think, like you said, benchmarking. There are countries that don't have these resources, that may have some challenges because they're emerging markets. And so they are looking at their neighbors, and they are looking at bigger markets to see what precedents there are. So, those are just some ideas.
I want to pick up on this maybe in two other facets. One of them is, Liz, you mentioned early on a little bit of maybe skepticism or watchfulness about the performance of satellite services using these broadband systems, and you wanted to make sure, in sort of a consumer watchdog role of their quality. And we had a question in the chat about whether you see how you see your role in the delivery of those services, less on the licensing of the ground equipment. Do you have like SLA requirements, or do you leave that to their commercial offerings? Do you have a sense of how do you approach that kind of validation of legitimate service?
Yeah, so it's not something that we deal with in our spectrum licensing, but it is something that our other colleagues who are more on the consumer side of things, or maybe in resilience, looking at cybersecurity, may be more interested in. So if you're delivering public electronic communications network or systems, then there are other obligations that would fall on you as that.
Right.
So yeah, they are separate regulations, but it is something that we are concerned with. So yeah.
So there's some element of consideration about the service, but maybe more from a security perspective than a kind of commercial commitment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. This is completely outside my area, so
Sorry.
but I don't think there are SLA
Yeah.
requirements per se. But
Yeah.
but yes, that all operators should be aware that there may be wider considerations. And in fact, we actually we worked together with some of our colleagues, put together another page that links from the Spectrum page, looking at some of those things that you might want to take into consideration when looking to deliver a service in the UK. So, yeah.
Okay. And Kim, how about, thank you. And thanks for going outside of the box a little bit there. Kim, do you have any insight into the kind of review of the quality of service or the nature of the service itself, or is that part of the other part of the licenses rather than the terminal licenses?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, it's not exactly part of the licensing process, where we have different kind of regulation regarding the quality of service that have been provided to the users in Brazil. We have regulations specifying this kind of commitment that all the service providers must comply here, and some SLA, as Liz mentioned before, must be established and must be reached here in our country. So we check all these elements, not only in the licensing perspective, but to understand how this kind of infrastructure are being or are helping our universal and really good connectivity across our country. And the competition is really important. This is one of the drivers of this kind of quality service, because we have this growing number of satellite systems in our country to bring a broadband connectivity, but we also have a lot of terrestrial service providers. So far, we have more than 20,000 service providers authorized here in Brazil, obviously not only using satellite infrastructure. So the market it's important to bring this kind of competition and elevate the level of quality. So what we experience here in Brazil is that the satellite systems are trying to compete with the terrestrial systems. They are providing broadband through fiber. So it's really difficult. Are completely different systems, but considering the competition and the rules that we establish, the transparency that the providers must to have with the consumers, we are seeing that the competition is helping us to maintain the high level quality service in our country. Obviously, we are trying to make it flexible and making the market regulate itself as possible, obviously, and any kind of intervention could be done. And if we check any problem. But so far we are seeing and experiencing a really good quality service, even through satellites.
So I'm going to just pick up on that. We had a question in the chat on how are regulators handling resistance by traditional broadband providers for the new entrants from LEO. And it sounds like for both of you, that overarching goal of competition, free market competition, and also a rich set of options for broadband are the tools that you can rely on to kind of address hesitance by incumbents for any new service, whether it's this or anything else. Is that the helpful tool that you lean on when you've got that kind of tension with newcomers and incumbents that are showing up in this area?
Please,
And
do you want to
Kim,
go
I'll let you
first?
take that since you had the mic
Okay.
open anyway, and then I'll see if Liz has anything else to add.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So sorry. Yeah, we see that we perceive the perception of this kind of tension because the incumbent service, honestly, and we are seeing that they are losing some kind of users because the quality of service is different. But at the same time, considering that this new technology, we are seeing other players trying to invest in their systems and offering different kind of service because these LEO constellations so far are trying to invest in the final users, and we are seeing the other companies trying to make agreements with companies and other kind of users, not only home users, but also the industry, other companies. So we believe, considering that expansion of this market here, we have a room for everyone. Obviously, it's complex to find your final client and the one that will support your operation. But yeah, there's some tension here, and we're trying to face in it with a certainty that these incumbent systems will not be interfered. So it was an important thing, and we're trying to make it as clear as possible. The newcomers cannot cause harmful interference and somehow deteriorate the operation of the incumbent systems. But we're trying to deal with that in a technical perspective, and also making our rules flexible enough that the incumbent systems could find another way in other markets where they can provide their capacity.
Thanks so much. That's super helpful. Janet, one of the questions was, how do regulators measure whether they've successfully implemented good rules? Like, is it the number of customers that have signed up? Is it, the number of providers, the traffic? Like how have you seen regulators assess their, success at after they've gone through this complicated and arduous process of evaluating and updating their rules. And then I'll ask Liz and Kim if you have anything you want to add. But Janet, have you seen, is it just publishing reports, or are there other metrics that regulators can use to kind of self-evaluate?
Well, I mean, I think part of it, of course, is, how successful is the service being in the particular country? What's the take-up that's happening? What type of complaints are the regulators hearing with regards
What's
to the
complaints?
service? And I mean, I think that's always a challenge, and I think it's interesting. I mean, you raised an issue earlier about consumer protection, and I think it is a challenge because a lot of these services you subscribe online, um, you know, um, and you may not be getting the service that you want. How do you respond to that? And so that is an area that I'm sure regulators are going to hear about, but I mean, generally, I think you see it in terms of what's been the speed of deployment, what's been the take up of the services. Those are typically good indications. I think you hear the complaints pretty quickly if it's not working effectively.
I'm not even going to ask you to, because I saw you both laugh at the word complaint, so I'm guessing that's one of your metrics for sure. We've had a couple questions about fees and how you arrived at the fees. So for Liz, the question was, how did Ofcom arrive at the annual fee of £500 for a Gateway Earth station? And we had a similar question for Brazil. What was your decision-making process? Did you benchmark it against other other licensing fee structures did you have? Was that an easier question for you to answer based on precedent, or was it one of the ones you struggled with? And I'll ask Liz first.
Again, this is slightly outside of my remit because the fees are set before I arrived, and it will be other colleagues who will do the review later this year. But I think the £500 is similar to what we charge for the TT&C license. And I think when it was set, we were not expecting very large numbers of gateway Earth stations, and it was deemed to be kind of proportionate for the effort that we would put in. I think, as we've seen, as you were saying, the much more interest that has been in NGSO FSS services and more interest. And in terms of fairness, just looking to see whether or not we should bring NGSO and GSO gateways onto a similar approach. They obviously have a different footprint, and in terms of how they share the spectrum with others, so it might not be exactly the same fee, but yes, I think that those are the sorts of things that we are starting to think about. So, yeah.
Kim, anything to add about the fee structure or?
Yeah, no,
or how
sure.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Patricia, I'd like to mention that as I was explaining in the presentation, we have a flat fee for the landing rights that was established by Anatel when we define it to recover just administrative costs. This was the basic fee process that we were working out with. So this is for the landing rights, if I'm not wrong, to about 2,000. $2,000 or something like that. $20,000. So sorry, I was just trying to remember the numbers here. And in add of that, we have fees for the licensing process. But these fees for licensing each Earth station, for example, is not defined by Anatel, it's defined by the Congress. And it's defined considering all different kind of stations. And today for the small terminals, VSATs, is the same fee that are applied for mobile phones. And this is one, this result was a battle and working from Anatel to talk to the Congress and tell them it's important to make this fee as lower as possible, because it's interesting to spread this kind of solution in Brazil. So in part, the administrative price for the landing rights established by Anatel, and we try to make a cost recovery cost. And the fees for the licensing was established for the other part of the government, specifically for the Congress. So, but we are always trying to dialogue with them, trying to make them understand that if we reduce this phase, this licensing phase, we can have different opportunities to spread and faster deployment of the technology here at Brazil.
Excellent. Janet, anything you wanted to add on this topic? I'm going to ask two questions that may be outside of your scope, and feel free to just say I'll point you to where it is on our website. We've had a couple questions that I would consider kind of in the enforcement category. One is, how do you handle lawful intercept and sort of those types of considerations when the gateway isn't resident in your own country? And that may not be your experience, partly because the UK has such a concentrated population and a lot of great fiber and a grand tradition of, space ground infrastructure. And I would guess for Brazil is such a large geography with so many gateways, that may not be as urgent of a question as it might be in other administrations. But have you given any thought to that? And then, or is there someplace on perhaps the Ofcom or Anatel website where those questions might be addressed? And yeah, I'll start with, then the other one is going to be sort of in the same vein, but I'll let both of you, if there's anything you can answer, and then Janet, I may see if there's any other kind of commonality that you can comment on, or how certain countries have handled it. Liz, why don't we go to you first?
Yeah, definitely. So again, this is not something that's tied to our spectrum licenses. Our licenses are just for spectrum matters.
Mhm.
Legal intercept is covered by the Investigatory Powers Act, which is actually handled by the Home Office in the UK.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so satellite operators who are operating in the UK or looking to operate in the UK should have a look there and consult their lawyers if necessary, but make sure that they comply with with those laws. But it's nothing to do with us in Ofcom. So.
Got
Yeah.
it. Okay. And Kim, is it also bifurcated in Brazil, or is that something that Anatel also uh, is responsible for?
Well, we have a really huge enforcement division that work and deal with different kind of things about the telecommunication service. So yeah, we do not have so far, and I'm not sure if you have it, but it's been discussed here recently, obligations to have gateways here in Brazil, or even an obligation that the traffic go through our fiber or backhaul or backbone here, where we are always trying to understand how it could affect our enforcement process and our enforcement power here. So yeah, we have different kind of controls, and we work with different agencies, or sometimes if a legal matter, other entities, governmental entities could be could address and could help us to address this situation. But we have enforcement division here that could help us to fix or trying to understand, monitoring the situation, and if needed, report all the situation to other organizations from the government to make it possible. But so far, we do not have this kind an obligation to put or all the gateways here and in Brazil for the operation of the system. But considering the vast territory, the operators themselves are putting it here, and they are facilitating our control about these aspects.
Janet, we've had a couple questions that I think are related to this area of regulating satellite-based communication services in the same kind of vein that you might a terrestrial service, whether it's data monitoring or security compliance. Is there any trend that you've seen internationally, or are there sort of regional differences that you're observing in that aspect, which is in some cases tied to either having a gateway licensed in country or starting to have that growth in subscriber terminals?
I think you definitely see that requirement popping up in terms of, local gateways. I mean, they're in the consultation that Bangladesh has. And if you look at the draft, it requires that you have a local gateway. That's not unique. I mean, you've seen it in other markets as well. I understand the focus in terms of, being security conscious and having concerns about lawful intercept and issues of that nature. But I also think that you're also seeing new measures that operators are also advancing in terms of these issues can be addressed by having things like regional gateways. This is particularly attractive if you've got, a small market. If you're talking about the Pacific, for example, it from an operator's perspective, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have requirements of local gateways in all of these small markets. So perhaps that's a better approach. You also have issues like geofencing that are being talked about, which basically, impose measures that require the operators to turn off um, their services and things like that. And you also have some cloud-based solutions that you're also seeing. So I do think that uh, there are new issues cropping up to address these concerns, and that perhaps may alleviate some of the demands for local gateways. But there, I understand why there would be these types of concerns.
So one of the challenges I think is that these topics are often not handled within the same regulatory organizations or the same regulatory offices, and they may not be topics of conversation in the same places where the licensing and spectrum conversations happen. And that's a that's definitely a challenge, but they are important in both the national character of how you approach a market and how successful or how complicated it is to actually start providing services. The other enforcement area is one that may be a little bit more controversial, but I let you all know I was going to ask it, so I'm not trying to pull the rug out here. And it has to do with kind of pirate terminal importation. Given how portable some of these satellite terminals are and user interest, this sort of high user interest in connectivity, we've seen a rash of examples where terminals are being imported for use into countries that have not yet authorized the service, and they're being imported from neighboring countries where they are approved. Now, I would not expect that either of you have had a lot of experience with this particularly, but I'm interested in your thoughts about how, for other regulators, maybe words of wisdom or encouragement for regulators who are starting to see these topics like sovereignty and enforcement come into play in these kinds of instances. Both of you were sort of early approvers of many of these services and obviously have lots and lots of them already authorized in your markets. But it's a hot topic for a lot of regions. Kim, do you have anything you might add to that kind of
Yeah,
question of
sure.
piracy and enforcement of the terminals?
Yeah,
They're
sure. As
slippery.
you mentioned, yeah, no, as you mentioned, Patricia, sometimes this kind of work it's done by different organizations, different entities in the government, and in our case, is the same thing. As I mentioned, we have border enforcement agencies that work in cooperation with NSL, so it's really important because we have borders with different countries, and for different kind of equipment, we are talking about here telecommunications equipment, but it's interesting and it's important for different kind of material equipment that could been bring to Brazil. So our Federal Revenue Service, or in other countries it's Internal Revenue Service, it's responsible for screening imports here. And if customs agents identify a product intended for telecommunications, for example, they separate it for inspection by an Anatel's enforcement team. So we can control like this, we team up with these guys. And our enforcement division is also highly active with a presence in all Brazilian states, allowing us to monitor and respond effectively to unauthorized telecommunication activity across the country. So we could receive reports from them or a kind of alert from the public, etc. Have different channels that Anatel could be access, and we could respond to this. But one of the main important thing is that we could cooperate with different organizations in the government. It's essential because we have a lot of people and a lot of products coming in and coming out, and it's essential that it's be part of the public policy of the country, not only for telecom. Obviously, we're talking about it right now, but this is our approach here. We cooperate with other organizations here, and they are helping us to avoid this kind of activity here in Brazil.
Janet, I'm going to ask you, I know you have done work with regulators and with constellation companies in regions where the regulators haven't yet gone through their updates or adjustments to their regulatory frameworks. They may not have yet approved services, but they may be next door to a country that has. Do you have any sort of insight to how this is being handled, or how the tension is being resolved between that sort of desire to have the connectivity maybe faster than the regulatory process is playing out?
No, we're definitely seeing it. I think we're seeing it in a number of countries. I mean, it's been an issue in various markets that we've been working in the Pacific. It was something that was, particularly in areas that are desperate for connectivity. The rural environments where they wanted it at no cost and it's not coming fast enough. The problem is that from a regulatory standpoint, these terminals are not, there's no service license for these terminals. So it is definitely a challenge, and I think as Kim said, I mean, you're seeing enforcement being taken sometimes by on the customs front. You're seeing cease and desist letters going to the operators.
Mhm.
And I think you're also seeing measures with regards to, as I mentioned, geoset fencing, which basically, effectively allows I'm not an engineer, I'm a lawyer, but it effectively allows um, the turning off of the terminal. So I mean, there are various measures, but it is a challenge because they're not that big. You can put them in a suitcase. You can put them in a laptop cover. Um, so you do see that happening, but it, these are some of the measures that I've seen.
Okay, super helpful. So now we're going to turn to, we've talked a lot about this in the context of kind of a consumer broadband service. And obviously, these services are also being used to connect companies and government offices. But we've also seen some new or different applications beyond the sort of consumer broadband or enterprise or government broadband. We've seen the heightened interest in using LEO constellations for Earth stations in motion, like connectivity to aircraft, connectivity to ships. We've also seen the use of this is maybe a longer standing kind of tradition to use satellite services for Internet of Things kind of passive sensors. And I wanted to ask you, I think I'll turn first to you, Liz, on how Ofcom has been differentiating between these different kinds of service applications and the way you're approaching the authorization of terminals on ships, planes, potentially railway, or for remote monitoring in sort of the IoT context. And then I'll ask you as well, Kim.
So the simple answer is if it's FSS, it's just one license. The Earth Station
Okay.
Network license covers everything. So whether it's land, ship, or aircraft, so in answer to one of the other comments or questions, we still would expect that as part of the ship radio license or the aircraft radio license, that the relevant administration would have registered the frequencies that are transmitted by that platform. But we wanted to have in one place so that the satellite operator could find easily the regulations that applied within the territory of the UK, whether that's in the air, in our territorial waters, or on the ground, that they were clear what their obligations were and how they could operate. So yeah, it's all in one place, and it's
Okay.
only £200 a year as well.
Oh,
That's the other
there you
thing.
go.
Yep.
Very
Yep.
economical. Kim, anything you want to add on the sort of additional uses that LEO constellations are starting to see? We're also seeing them. I know Brazil's been an early adapter of looking at the use of LEO constellations for agricultural uses, kind of precision agriculture. And how are you thinking about those terminals differently? Do they fit into the structure you laid out for consumer broadband, or are there other measures that you're looking at?
Okay, no, perfect. Thank you for the question. It's relevant, and we receive these questions so many times here because these kind of Earth stations and motions, they are really interesting to our country, and obviously the airline companies also have this kind of interest. So, as I mentioned, at this point, Earth station motion still requires an individual licensing, but we are already working to make it possible through a blanket license process, because we imagine that we pop up in our country and have a lot of different Earth stations in motion working here. So we would like to simplify this process. On top of that, I would like to mention that in the last World Radio Conference, we approved new recommendations for the use of non-GSO systems in K-band, operating with this kind of Earth station in motion, and we are making it and bringing it to our national regulation. So we are updating our technical requirements because one of our concerns about this kind of operation is that don't cause harmful interference to other systems. It's important to make our country free from this kind of interference, and everyone working together in a really good coexistence way. So we have these two approaches here. We are running to adapt our licensing process to make it possible to use blank license to Earth Station Motion as well, and we are updating our technical requirements to bring the recommendations, the limits that were established on the last World Radio Conference to Brazil, and make easier to the operators to use this kind of application here, because we believe, and the operators have already reached us, question us about the possibility, and they really have a huge interest in this kind of application. And again, IoT, it's something that we are seeing that we grow in Brazil as well. It's not exactly for FSS, it's MSS basically, but MSS, it's something that we are also trying to make happen in our country, but our regulatory framework is already adapted to these kind of things. A little bit adjustments that we need to make, but it's possible to have the authorization and start to operate. And considering that we have this update of our technical requirements, we'll have it for exams working and communicating with in GSO systems as fast as we can.
Awesome. Janet, is there anything you want to add from your vantage point in other markets about, you know, the sort of progress they're making on looking at authorizations for different kinds of platforms, including mobile platforms, or do IoT rules even need to be updated, considering, you know, they are being traditionally delivered with MSS?
I mean, I think one of the issues on the IoT front, and it's basically more in terms of their classification, right? In terms of, you know, in Europe, you generally have relatively easy in terms of the classification, but I think in some other markets, it's less clear as to, you know, what category they fall into, how they're being perceived. So you have inconsistency, shall we say, in terms of how they're licensed and what obligations they're subject to. And as part of that, you know, you have in certain instances, you know, requirements that they have to comply with, pretty onerous requirements in terms of security plans, in terms of lawful intercept, even in Europe that we've encountered, which, you know, are quite cumbersome, and given the types of services, don't necessarily seem to make sense. But those are some of the challenges that we face, and I think it's just a new service, and people are just trying to grapple with it, and how it's going to be used.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question about direct to device, now that we're talking about evolving and emerging use cases for LEO constellation delivered services. As we think of those next considerations in this, you know, super dynamic area, it would just be, we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on the many proposals to leverage constellations to support and expand mobile telephony and cellular services in their networks, which, you know, is often shorthanded into direct to device. Now, this is a new, an emerging topic of conversation. So I'm not going to put any of you on the spot to preview decisions or predict conclusions on this emerging tech, because there's so many variations unfolding now. But I do think I could ask you, as you're starting to look at this additional new area, what precedents or processes are you all relying on to kind of build familiarity and shape the thinking in this area? Is this an area where the ITU can be helpful in offering a venue where regulators can compare approaches and considerations to discuss? How are you, not how is it going to come out, but what tools are you reaching for when you're starting to consider this this new use case? And Liz, I'm going to you first. You're going to get a few minutes to think about this one.
So hot off the press, we have put out a consultation yesterday,
Oh,
looking at an authorization in the UK for direct-to-device. So we do recognise the importance of international regulations. We are involved in the process at the ITU. We recognise that will not conclude until the end of 2027. Meanwhile, there are some services that could be available more quickly. We ran a call for input last year and had quite a lot of responses from both satellite operators and MNOs with a view that while we were blessed again with a good laydown of terrestrial infrastructure, there was benefit in some areas and for some resilience if anything was to go wrong with our terrestrial network. So yes, I would just encourage everybody to read that and digest it, and by all means do reach out if you have any questions.
And that's on your Ofcom website?
It is, yes, on the Ofcom website.
I'm guessing in a prominent position. It's so freshly
Possibly.
issued.
There you go. Yeah. But
Kim,
Mobile from Space and Sky, I think is what it's called. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's breaking news. You heard it here first. Kim, from Brazil's perspective, I'm guessing you are also starting to get inquiries about this service. What are you using in terms of tools to shape your thinking and the discussion internally?
Okay, thank you for this question. It's good to talk about it because it's a hot up here and in Intel as well. Well, we're considering this kind of application and the interest of the market since the last year when we received a request for testing this kind of application here in Brazil. We already had one test with the MNOs and satellite operators trying to make it happen here, and we have it, and it was great. So this is a great opportunity, again, considering how big is Brazil, and we have rural areas and roads that must be connected. This is a kind of solution that we are seeing in the near future, at least, medium term at least, something that could help us to deliver connectivity throughout the country. So we established a regulatory sandbox here for this kind of tests to promote this kind of application and this kind of tests here in Brazil, and encouraging the MNOs and the satellite operators to try to work together to make it happen via regulatory sandbox, because one of our main rules is that for the use of a frequency band here, it must be properly allocated and designated to a kind of service. And for IMT frequency bands, we still do not have allocation for MSS, for example. So before to change our regulatory framework, we adopting this kind of method, this regulatory sandbox. They're helping us in different approaches and different perspectives, and it's a mechanism that we believe that will be helpful to understand better the competitive aspects, the technical aspects, before we modify our rules in fact. So this is one of the pros, and we are obviously excited about this possibility, as I mentioned. So I believe there will be a great thing in our country.
I mean, I think both of you as regulators have shown how valuable it is to establish the process and the methods that any kind of new regulatory puzzle as presented to you is going to be handled in terms of consulting with the public, in terms of framing the key issues, in terms of moving through assessment, deliberation, and eventually a new rule. So, Janet, I wanted to ask you, we had a good question about the role of the ITU. I wanted to kind of shape this a little bit in the context of these emerging issues like mobile platforms, like direct-to-device, but also in the context of your comment on standards and type approvals, that sort of process that often happens separately and behind closed doors as the manufacturers of terminals and service providers get their equipment type approved and through homologation. I wanted to ask you, Janet, the question itself is, where are you seeing the ITU being kind of most effective in these late breaking questions? The ITU is not always able to adopt new rules as quickly as a national regulator can, given their 4-year World Radio Conference cycle. but where have you seen the ITU most kind of helpful in this challenge for regulators to understand and assess and develop new regulatory approaches?
Well, I mean, I think as was mentioned earlier, I mean, we obviously have some of these issues going to be addressed
Mhm.
in the WRC context, and obviously in the working groups that lead up to the next World Radio Conference. So, I mean, that might not be the speediest approach, but it is where conversations are definitely underway. Um, and so I do think that those are key in terms of from the radio communication sector. I would say, plugging you guys, I would also say that, these types of forums are very useful as well. And I understand that you may be having a specific one on this very topic coming up. So I do think that that will is a good venue to have informal conversations on some of these things. I mean, you asked, which regulators have looked at this issue. I mean, you're seeing, not only the UK and also Brazil, but Canada has been looking at this obviously in the US. We've seen quite a bit of discussion in terms of different uh, consultations on this very topic and certain decisions. So I think those are all good precedents. But it, directed device, there's lots of different models. You have different partnerships. You have the MNO model. You have the model, where you have direct to cell, you have direct to device. So there's a lot of different issues. And as we've noted, I mean, you have, spectrum issues, you have business model issues, you have, so there's a lot there. And so I think the ITU can be very useful, not only in terms of perhaps the technical side on the radio communication side, but also in assisting with some of the other matters as well.
So we're absolutely, thinking about these topics that can't be addressed in like a 5-minute side question that are really complex and need to be discussed not only with what's being how to regulate them, but also what's actually being proposed in the marketplace and how they differ in terms of potential regulatory treatment. So thanks for that plug, Janet. We are thinking about a session on direct to device in this Space Connect series coming ahead, which is why I was okay with not not having a full sort of discussion about it here. Janet, I did want to come back to the regional groups too. So I was really excited to see that many of these topics and even the foundational questions about gateway licensing when you have more of them and more potential for spectrum interference, and the topics about terminal licenses when you're starting to move from uh, thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Can you give a little sense of how those regional groups are gearing up, and just an encouragement about how to participate if there are governments that are kind of looking for continuations of this conversation in a regional context?
Well, I think one of the interesting things, I mean, I highlighted the regional ones, but, we're also seeing particularly in the African region, not only on a regional basis, but also sub-regional.
Yeah.
So IACO is also focused on these issues. It's just one example, but I think, they are trying to address these issues. And I think the ATU has been very good about focusing on emerging technologies and has a subgroup with regards to this and have been very engaged in these efforts. Um, lots of countries in that region, lots of different interests and approaches. So, but I do think that that's a very good forum that's been looking at this. They're not mandatory. They are recommendations, but I do think they're useful. I think it's CTEL that was mentioned by Kim as well, that they look to that, and SEPT, as was mentioned by Liz, and I think in Asia as well. So, I mean, I think they are useful forums, particularly for smaller countries that may not necessarily have the resources to tackle these issues in the same way that a Brazil or the UK or the US in terms of just resources.
There's always a benefit in the hard work and distress of regulators that have gone through complicated technical questions and policy questions to come out with regulations. There's always a value in being able to look at those hard-won experiences, and that's why I was so pleased to put together you three today. So that wraps up our episode today on gateways and user terminals. I'd like to thank our three amazing panelists, Liz, Kim, and Janet, for sharing your insights so candidly on gateways and terminals and providing great advice. You were just awesome. So thanks to the mighty ITU team that supports this ITU Space Connect series and makes these discussions so thoroughly fascinating and smooth. I want to thank too all of you for listening. You've had terrific questions. We've tried to address as many of them as we can. It definitely reassures us that covering the ground networks was important and timely, and we'll continue to look for topics that we think are relevant and on your mind as we continue this monthly Space Connect series. I hope you'll be back with us for our next Space Connect episode, which will be later in April. It will be a chat with some amazing women leaders in space and satellites to celebrate Girls in ICT Day, which is on Thursday, the 24th of April. That conversation will be a little different in format as we instead explore some pivotal career moments, some industry evolution perspectives, and also practical advice for the next generation of women in space and ICT fields. We'll basically bring together some established pioneers and emerging talent. So keep a watch out for that and for more information in the next week or so. And if you want to make it easier to follow us, you can sign up for update emails on the ITU Space Connect series by entering your email on the ITU Space Connect webpage. In the meantime, we'll post this video and the presentations that our three awesome speakers offered on the ITU Space Connect page. If you didn't see our prior episodes, please do check them out online, either at the ITU page or on YouTube. And, tell all your friends. For now, thank you all for joining, and I wish you all a good day. Thanks.
Recording stopped.